Let's be honest, Conan's Lost Dungeon is likely the game's worst building set. Despite each extension and iteration improving on the original offering, Dungeon still falls short of pretty much any other set. It's ugly and difficult to use, but despite that, today I'm going to show you 5 tips and tricks to make Lost Dungeon not only palatable, but usable. So without further ado, let's get started. Firstly, just a bit of housekeeping. Lost Dungeon has a very strange build order, meaning certain pieces need to go before others. You'll learn it with experience, but the biggest annoyance is definitely the spiral staircases. They're quite prone to misbehaving, especially with rounded walls, so try and place the rounded walls first, and then the stairs, and then build the rest around it. That seems to be the most consistent method to avoid issues with those. Also, if you're trying to transition out of alcoves and into rounded walls, it often just won't work. To fix that, add ceilings atop the alcoves, then add the curved walls, and then remove the ceilings. Finally, just a general tip that helps with this style: build everything on a foundation platform. It makes life a lot easier as you have a solid base to build from. So with that, let's get into these specific tips. Firstly, and arguably most importantly, is shape. Some sets thrive on contrast and tonal differences, but Dungeon is the same all around. The best way to get around that is with solid, strong shapes. It's easy to build something like this, but to be honest, it's kind of ugly, so let's make it better. There we go, that is a marked improvement. The base plate has not changed at all, but what I've done instead is use strong core shapes and added more delicate shapes around it. The anchor of the build is the large box at the centre, aided by cylinders in the corners and a rounded space just at the top to cap it off. You then have much smaller shaping elements like crenellated walls and vaulted ceilings to add more fine detail, all of which help to make this build stand out a lot more. Dungeon has a habit of looking kinda just like a blob, as it's basically the same colour and texture across the board, so strong shapes are almost essential in making it stand out. Use the contrast of circles and squares alongside segments of clear and evident shape to make this set much better. Next, tiering. If you've watched any of my many build tip videos, which if you haven't you should, you'd know that I hate long boring walls like these. It feels really flat to me, and that issue is made even worse with Lost Dungeon, so let's use tiering to fix it. Tiering is quite simple. It's the concept of gradually adjusting the floor space in tiers, the ground floor usually being the first and the biggest, and the top being the last and the smallest. It's best to do this floor by floor, as it just kinda makes sense that way. You can also hollow out areas, just any general movement of structure really helps out in this aspect. The downside is this method does compromise on floor space in favour of aesthetics, but to be honest that's the case for most aesthetic focused buildings. By building in tiers, it elevates the shaping from the first tip and just makes the build far more visually interesting, breaking up the oppressive monotony that Dungeon has. This tip is super useful. Thirdly, mixing. This video is of course about Lost Dungeon, but sometimes you need to mix and match. Unfortunately, Dungeon doesn't have many viable combinations, but there are a few extras you can use to elevate the set. Namidian and insulated wood are both good roof pieces. A decent wall combo is black ice, though I must say I'm not a huge fan personally. A great option for more refined windows are storm glass, especially with the cathedral rounded tops. Storm glass also makes for a good floor replacement. And finally, arena stairs are a decent option for raising the tonality of your build just a little, but try not to overdo it with these pieces. Combining multiple of those extras together is a really good way to adapt and improve on what Lost Dungeon has to offer. Personally, I'm a little bit of a Dungeon purist. I think if I'm going to use Dungeon, then I'm only going to use Dungeon most of the time, but it's always good to have these options available. Having these extras in your back pocket can help elevate your designs greatly. Next, the ever-intangible factor of vibes. Dungeon is dark and dingy, so most will opt to light it with just standard light sources. Nothing wrong with that really, and it's good for some builds, but lighting and cultivating the vibes is one of the biggest factors in making Dungeon look good. Dungeon is one of the best sets for taking advantage of lighting, and in the right builds, swapping the standard warm lighting for something else changes everything. For all of its faults, Dungeon is right up there with Stormglass and Arena in how it works with light. Dungeon of course lends itself well to dark and more malevolent builds, so when it suits, experiment with different lighting colours, especially with radium torches, and see how much it elevates the vibes. Finally, balance. This is a bit of a weird one, it's quite a broad concept, but also basically applies to every building set in the game. Balance is the idea of having a good distribution of height, length and density across your build. Take this design for example. It has a simple core that is balanced out by the side buildings. The symmetry ties everything together and overall creates a cohesive build that looks more like a unit as opposed to 3 separate builds placed close together. It's always a good idea to have balance, but that doesn't mean you always need symmetry either. Take this build for example, it's incredibly asymmetrical, but it's still balanced by its sloping nature, retaining a logical shape and structure whilst not being symmetrical in the slightest. I hate to say it, there isn't really a good way to teach balance as such, it's something that just comes with experience. Some will doubtless find it easier than others, but balance is really the ultimate hack to a good build, not only with Dungeon, but with basically any building set. And that wraps up our 5 tips for the Lost Dungeon set. Shape, tiering, mixing, vibes, and balance. 5 techniques that should help you to elevate one of Conan's worst building sets. Thank you for watching, and of course a massive thanks to our wonderful esteemed coffee cultists for continuing to support the channel over on Patreon. If you enjoy my content, check out the Patreon linked in the description and the pinned comment to get content early, alongside plenty of other benefits. Again, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you soon.